We live in an era when the culture of reading, now more than ever, is based on guilt. If you're reading a great book, an important book, a work of philosophy, a work of history or something, and you find it boring, culturally, we're conditioned to refuse to acknowledge and suppress that sense of boredom. If you find this book boring, what does that say about you? Doesn't that mean that you are the sort of person who can't appreciate Aristotle, who can't appreciate why this great book is so great? So you ought to feel ashamed of yourself. And the motivation for reading books on paper in the first place may indeed be no more and no less than guilt of a similar sort, that you would feel guilty, you would feel ashamed of yourself if you haven't read Shakespeare. And then for that reason, maybe you didn't really question what your motivations were for reading Shakespeare, what it was you hoped to get out of it, and then what it is you're disappointed with if you feel boredom. So the most fundamental suggestion I have in this video is to take your own boredom seriously, to examine your own boredom, to analyze your own boredom. If you want, you could say even to have sympathy for yourself, to have sympathy for the reader, whether it's you or someone else, for why it is they find this boring, and then to use that sense of boredom as a guide to find out what the problem is. In many cases, the problem will be that you weren't honest with yourself about what your motivations were for reading the book in the first place. But in some cases, the problem will be that you don't have enough historical knowledge, enough knowledge of the surrounding cultural context to make reading that book interesting. So let's say one example would be the Christian Bible. What is interesting about the Christian Bible? Now, let's just say hypothetically for you watching this video, for the particular person watching this video, let's say what you're really interested in is the history of slavery and the excuses that have been made for slavery by Europeans within the last 500 years or even the last 1,000 years, let's say, okay? So that's interesting for you. So then for you, maybe it's really rewarding to read the Bible and to do kind of comparison of select passages with some other book or some other source you have that explains how these passages were kind of cynically interpreted or deployed in history, how, some of the popes of the Catholic Church were pro-slavery and some of them were anti-slavery. It's not the case that we're making an objective judgment that the Bible is worth reading, or that it's interesting, or that it's rewarding, or that it's important in isolation. This isn't intrinsic to the Bible. This is something extrinsic to the Bible. In most of these cases, your reasons for reading an important book of philosophy, history, or nonfiction of any kind will be, in this sense, extrinsic, but you may not be clearly aware of why it is, of what it is that you're looking for, and maybe what it is you're disappointed with if you don't find it there. So this person, let's say a person in the audience, who decides to read the Bible because of an interest in slavery, if they just sit down and begin reading the Bible from beginning to end, they will be bored, right? That boredom is something you should take seriously. Now, again, and the point isn't that they shouldn't read the Bible at all, but if that's their research interest, if that's their motivation, then in a sense, they're reading the Bible the wrong way by trying to read it from beginning to end. They're going to be reading an enormous amount of wildly irrelevant mythological crap, just incoherent discussions of topics that don't interest them in any way. They probably need to sit down with a list of specific passages and some secondary source, and probably some more kind of analytical and critical works about the history of slavery and Judaism and Christianity and Western Europe and how those things relate to the Bible, so that reading will be rewarding for them. So this will be meaningful research. Now, a few months ago, it's not that many months ago, my girlfriend Melissa decided that she would finally read the Bible, and I think her assumption was she'd start reading it beginning to end, because she was someone who was raised with a kind of very cynical and dishonest Christian education, frankly, like most American Protestants, where she really had no familiarity with the Bible as a whole. She didn't know what the text was about, even kind of section by section. If you break down the Old Testament into its major portions, she had no sense of what biblical literature was. where it fit into world history, culture, and so on, what it said and what it didn't say. She had only been given, these select reading passages presented carefully by a pastor, I guess, by a church leader. It's kind of this intentional misrepresentation of and cherry picking of the Bible. So in contrast to that cherry picking, she was interested in reading the text as a whole. So look, these two examples are counterposed, right? Because the first person who's reading about slavery, what I'm recommending positively is a sort of cherry picking, is just selecting the parts that interest them. And then in Melissa's case, it's sort of the opposite. Like, she had an interest in counteracting sort of propaganda, intentionally flattering and misleading introduction to the Bible she had by really reading the text as a whole. Now, it is needless to say that she immediately got very discouraged, very demotivated. Melissa found reading the Bible boring. And I put in a lot of work. I was talking to her about the history of the text, where it comes from, why the Bible is the way it is, talking about the Old Testament here. A lot of stuff I've picked up over the years. By the way, from a completely atheist perspective. But I was explaining to her why this is important historical evidence, shall we say. I'm in no way religiously Christian or Jewish, but still I can recognize what's important about this, almost in an archaeological sense, for digging up the development of civilization in that part of the world. And of course it had knock-on effects for the whole world, because Christianity went on to conquer so much of the world, as did Islam, so on and so forth. But what you have to examine then is, why do I find this boring? What motivated me to read this in the first place? Quite likely you were motivated by a misconception about a false set of assumptions about that text and what you'd find there, what would be meaningful about it, right? And then I think you have to examine, is there something else you need to know that could make this research meaningful and relevant to you? Or maybe not at all. Maybe you just drop it. Maybe you just give up on reading the Bible. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if Melissa could focus and sharpen her reasons, like become more precise and incisive. What was it she wanted to know out of the Bible? It obviously wasn't what she found in reading kind of the book of Genesis, and it wasn't what I was telling her when I was saying, well, look, here's what's interesting about this. What's interesting about this, for example, is that the Old Testament is full of evidence of the pre-monotheistic religion. Back when this was a polytheist, it's full of evidence of how Judaism as we know it today emerged from a totally different religion. It's normally referred to as First Temple Judaism, that the incoherence and repetition of the Old Testament is itself evidence of how that text was revised and redacted and even kind of censored by these later generations that wanted to make this into a monotheistic religion, whereas it really was not a monotheistic religion in the more ancient period. That you have this, the contestation of what the future of Judaism should be is preserved forever in the past of what Judaism was in the very incoherence of the Old Testament. So that's a little bit interesting, if that's what you want to know. But obviously that was not what she was expecting to see at all when she opened the Bible. And I think she needs to re-examine what it was she was expecting, or what it was she wanted to know, what it is she still wants to know now, right? So we had a question from the audience. Araya on Discord was asking, when reading philosophy, should she, I assume this is a she, should she read the primary source, kind of first and foremost in isolation, or is it better to study the intellectual context that the book is a response to? That's her wording. Is it better, to understand, she gives the example, is it better to understand the French Revolution, or is it better to read Karl Marx in isolation? Because I've talked a lot about how important the history of the French Revolution is for understanding what Karl Marx was doing in the Communist Manifesto, in his philosophy, economics, and politics in general, right? This will sound like a cop-out answer, but I'm really being sincere when I say this, right? The answer has a lot to do with you, with what motivates you, with what interests you, not with what makes Marx important kind of in isolation. If you just reify the writings of Karl Marx and say this is important. And again, this is why we have to get away from the aesthetic of guilt. like, oh, don't you feel guilty about yourself because you never read Karl Marx and it's this important book and you ought to be the sort of person who reads it. Well, it's not a judgment on the kind of person you are in this sense. What you need to examine is, what are your expectations? What is it you're trying to find, or you assume you're going to find in this book? And then then once you start reading it, quite likely you're going to be bored because the book is neither asking the questions you wanted it to ask, nor is it answering the questions you wanted to answer. So from my perspective, I know nothing about this person. I know nothing about Araya. It is very likely that you will find the history of the French Revolution more rewarding and more interesting than reading Karl Marx in isolation. It's likely, right? And then learning the history of the French Revolution provides a context within which reading Marx is rewarding and interesting as a response to that history of the French Revolution. Okay? To me, that makes sense. But maybe your reasons for reading Karl Marx are completely different. So, for example, maybe what interests you in Karl Marx is, let's say you're someone who studied economics in university, like you did intro to economics in high school, and then history of macroeconomics and microeconomics in university. Like, you're not the world's greatest expert, but you're someone who has a fundamental education in economics. Maybe your interest is in reading Karl Marx as a response to and a critique of classical economics. So that's a different context for understanding Marx or appreciating Marx. So then it wouldn't be the French Revolution that would make it interesting for you, right? It would be reading and maybe directly comparing, the claims that Karl Marx makes about economics to classical economists who wrote before him. And you could include maybe some of the critics of Karl Marx who were in his lifetime or immediately after him. You'd see how he fits into that continuity, the development of economic theory. Even something as simple as the theory of prices and this kind of thing, how scarcity relates to prices, how the value of labor relates to prices, and this kind of, it's not that interesting. It's not interesting to me, but it might be what motivates you. But I think many people would be open in Karl Marx and not even thinking through what is it that's supposed to make this interesting for them. So then they're baffled and discouraged by their own boredom. But if you can really examine that boredom and understand that boredom, then you make meaningful progress one way or another. And that progress may indeed involve or require that you work outside of the text you're studying to look at historical context, cultural context, or a competing philosophical context, where you need to understand this philosophy was written as a direct response to and criticism of some other philosophy, some other political tendency, what have you. So Karl Marx is also an example that's embedded in my own romantic relationship with Melissa, right? I started making videos about Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto because Melissa decided she was going to read the Communist Manifesto. Again, possibly with some of these ideas. In Melissa's case, she really noticed that here on YouTube, a lot of people in her generation have now gone all the way over to being communist, or they've embraced forms of socialism that are so far to the left and Marxist. This has become popular again in 2020 after a long period of disaffection with Marxism, socialism, and communism. She sees this wave rising, and she's interested in examining Marx as the kind of source text or locus classicus, so that all of these assumptions are put onto Marx as being this great work that inspires and informs this political movement that's happening again now around her. And of course, she feels alienated from that. Melissa is not a Marxist. Melissa is not a communist. Melissa is not a socialist. On the contrary, the research and reading Melissa has been doing in the last 3 years, she has really seen what a disaster communism was in every way, including, of course, China. That in China, it was this unbelievable disaster. So she's sitting there saying, she's really conversant with the ways in which Marxist economic theory doesn't work, the ways in which socialism and communism don't work. She's sitting there thinking, well, a lot of people in her generation, including white people from Detroit, Michigan, but people from the United States of America, they're getting really excited about Marx. So what are those people getting excited about? You may not find the answer to that question by just sitting down and reading this book beginning to end. She started reading Marx and she got bored. She stopped reading it. And so that series of YouTube videos I was making, I was talking in quite some depth and detail about Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, and so on. That stopped for me also, right? But what you have to do is examine that boredom And then understanding analytically the real basis of your own boredom is going to guide you for how to move forward with your own reading and your own research. One of the responses from the audience in my Discord where this discussion took place, someone just wrote back immediately to Araya, Desukaful, is how I pronounce his or her name, said, personally, I think it would be better to do both at the same time, to both read the primary source text and study the historical context, because properly understanding the context of a work can take weeks, months, years, etc. There is a ghost haunting this issue, and that is the question of whether or not you can get good secondary sources at all. Another person in the discussion pointed out that, for example, when I talk about ancient Greece or when I talk about Buddhism, I'm always emphasizing primary source, primary source, primary source. Either you're reading the primary source or nothing, right? And that's true. I mean, that observation of me is true. And that is because the secondary sources are so often propaganda. What do I mean by propaganda? I mean they are intentionally misleading. I have a lot of conflicts with my friend Muhammad about this. I feel he is not cynical enough about reading secondary sources about history and politics. I think he very lightly takes on kind of flattering things that are being said about history. And it's like, no, dude, you're not really open-minded to the possibility that this kind of flattery of what happened historically is covering over failure and disaster, like the extent to which you can be encountering propaganda, including, by the way, propaganda through omission, just not mentioning things that were really of crucial importance to understanding how horrible something was or how or why something failed, what really happened. So it's very easy to assume that the person in the audience has access to a secondary source that's going to tell them about the French Revolution. And, look, the French Revolution, it's one of the most contentious, the most laden with propaganda, one of the most romanticized events in the history of the world, including, of course, the propaganda romanticization created by Karl Marx himself and all of the Marxists following after it. There's a fascinating book I've only read the first few chapters of. I'd like to read the whole book, written by Napoleon's younger brother. And it's completely dishonest. It's a first-person perspective on that history, including the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power, and I assume his fall from power later in the book. But it's written like by someone who's in like an emotionally shattered state at the end of that history, someone who lived through it, and he's writing with absolutely no honesty. And of course, in terms of omission, it omits, massacres. Already in the first couple chapters, the things I'm reading, and I'm like, yeah. You guys are leaving out a lot of people who were shot dead in the street at this point, and were you personally, where like the young Napoleon was there killing people in the street. So this is the ultimate problem we're up against. The primary sources can be incredibly misleading, deceptive, and dishonest. The secondary sources can be incredibly misleading and dishonest. Still to this day, what book could I possibly recommend for you on the history of Buddhism, right? Seems like such a simple topic. There must be tons of books. Guess what? In English, they're all garbage. They're all propaganda. They're all lying to you. I mean, like really, really terrible. They're way more dishonest than histories of the Catholic Church that are written by Catholics. Catholics now generally have the attitude that they have to face up to racism, genocide, slavery, war. Like they have to face up to the darkness of the Dark Ages and have some kind of, critical response to it. Buddhism has not evolved to this point. Okay, let me tell you, you're going to get 100% dishonest, deceptive propaganda history of Buddhism. You could say something similar about Islam. You could say something similar about the French Revolution. So the assumption that when moving from primary source to secondary source, you're moving from something dishonest to something honest is false. The secondary sources are often more dishonest, and the secondary sources in providing you with context can only mislead you more than the primary source. So thus, I close the video with the same thing I opened the video with. The one piece of solid advice I can give you on this kind of reading and research is to examine your own boredom so that you understand precisely what are the questions you want to ask. What are the questions you expect this text to answer. And if those questions are neither being asked nor answered in the specific text, whether it be a book of philosophy, politics, or history, where are you going to look to furnish yourself with that context? Whether those are questions of slavery, questions of economics, questions about religion, questions about war, questions about gender or something. What you're really interested in is the status of women in this period of history. And that's not mentioned at all in the primary source, the secondary source. Where can you go to add that context so that you're reading it in that? Or how can you add in the other side of the debate when the primary source is tacitly and implicitly one half of a debate and the other half is left up to your imagination? Being honest about what makes this interesting to you, if you're analytical about it, it's not going to lead to a more biased reading of history. It's going to lead to you being aware of your own bias and then having a kind of incisive angle on the bias of the various authors that are collectively constructing that history before your eyes.